On the evening of December 14, 2019, 20-year-old Nadine Lott left home, expecting to spend a quiet Saturday night with someone she believed she knew. The Christmas season had settled over County Meath, Ireland. Streets were decorated with festive lights, restaurants were crowded with families celebrating the holidays, and pubs echoed with music as friends gathered for one last weekend before Christmas. For most people, it was an ordinary winter evening. For Nadine, it would become the final night of her life. She was known by friends and family as warm, compassionate, and full of energy. Those closest to her described a young woman who loved spending time with the people she cared about and who had a remarkable ability to make others laugh. At just 20 years old, she was beginning to build the future she had imagined for herself. Like many young adults, Nadine balanced work, friendships, and the excitement of adulthood. She enjoyed nights out, treasured time with loved ones, and looked forward to the opportunities that lay ahead. Nothing suggested that this December evening would become one of Ireland's most heartbreaking criminal cases. That night, Nadine attended a Christmas gathering before meeting her boyfriend, 𝘕𝘢𝘥𝘪𝘯𝘦. To outsiders, they appeared to be an ordinary young couple. Like many relationships, theirs had experienced difficulties, but few people could have imagined how dramatically the evening would unfold. As the hours passed, the couple eventually returned to Murdogh's home in Ardinu, County Meath. What happened inside that house would later become the focus of a lengthy police investigation and a closely watched murder trial. The only people present were Nadine and Daniel. No independent witnesses observed the events that followed. Investigators would later spend months reconstructing those final hours using forensic evidence, phone records, medical examinations, and 𝘕𝘢𝘥𝘪𝘯𝘦's own statements. According to evidence presented in court, an argument developed between the couple during the night. Exactly how the disagreement began has never been fully established through independent evidence. What is known is that sometime during the early hours of December 15, Nadine suffered catastrophic injuries. Emergency services were eventually contacted. Paramedics arrived to find a young woman in critical condition. Despite desperate efforts by first responders and medical staff, the injuries she had sustained were devastating. She was transported to hospital, where doctors fought to save her life. News of the incident quickly spread through the local community. Friends struggled to understand how someone so young could suddenly be fighting for survival. Family members rushed to the hospital, hoping for good news. Instead, they faced every family's worst nightmare. On December 17, 2019, 2 days after the incident, Nadine Lott died from her injuries. She was 20 years old. Her death immediately transformed what had first appeared to be a serious assault investigation into a homicide inquiry. Detectives from the Garda National Bureau of Criminal Investigation joined local officers to determine exactly what had happened during those final hours. The investigation centered on the house where Nadine had been found. Crime scene specialists carefully documented every room. Forensic experts searched for biological evidence, fingerprints, clothing, and any object that might help establish the sequence of events. Every detail mattered. Investigators examined bloodstain patterns, digital evidence, mobile phone activity, witness statements from friends who had seen the couple earlier that evening. Medical reports became equally important. Pathologists carefully documented the injuries Nadine had suffered, comparing those findings with the physical evidence recovered from the scene. Meanwhile, detectives interviewed 𝘕𝘢𝘥𝘪𝘯𝘦. His account of what had happened became one of the central issues in the investigation. As officers compared his statements against forensic findings, they began identifying inconsistencies that required further examination. The investigation continued for months. Experts reconstructed timelines. Digital specialists recovered electronic evidence. Forensic scientists prepared reports that prosecutors believed would later become critical in court. Outside the investigation, Ireland reacted with profound sadness. Tributes appeared across social media. Friends shared photographs and memories of Nadine. Flowers were left in her memory. Community members organized vigils, refusing to allow her death to become just another headline. For many people, Nadine represented far more than a victim of violent crime. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's best friend, a young woman whose future had ended before it truly began. As detectives completed their investigation, prosecutors faced a difficult task. They would need to prove beyond reasonable doubt exactly what had happened inside that house. The courtroom would become the place where every piece of evidence, every forensic finding, and every witness statement would be carefully examined. The answers would determine whether Nadine Lott's death had been a tragic accident, an act of violence, or something else entirely. Those questions would soon be placed before a jury, beginning one of Ireland's most closely followed murder trials in recent years. On December 17, 2019, after 2 days in intensive care, Nadine Lott died from the injuries she had sustained. The announcement sent shockwaves across Ireland. What had initially been investigated as a serious assault was now officially a homicide investigation. For Nadine's family, there would be no miracle, no recovery, no opportunity to hear her describe what had happened during the final hours of her life. The only people who knew what had taken place inside the house that night were no longer able to tell the same story. One was gone forever. The other would become the central figure in one of Ireland's most closely watched murder investigations. Within hours of Nadine's death, detectives from Garda 𝘕𝘠𝘵 intensified their investigation. The property in Ardunu, County Meath, was sealed off as a major crime scene. Uniformed officers established a security cordon, while forensic specialists began the painstaking process of documenting every possible piece of evidence. Nothing was considered too small. Every room was photographed from multiple angles before investigators touched a single object. Walls, floors, furniture, doorways, and windows were carefully examined. Each item was cataloged, labeled, and preserved for laboratory analysis. Crime scene investigators understood that homicide cases are often solved not through one dramatic discovery, but through dozens of small details that fit together like pieces of a puzzle. Forensic experts spent hours examining bloodstain patterns throughout the property. These patterns often provide investigators with valuable information about how injuries occurred, where they occurred, and whether a victim had been moved after suffering those injuries. Measurements were taken. Photographs were recorded. Samples were collected for scientific examination. Every finding would later be compared against witness statements and medical evidence. Detectives also seized clothing believed to have been worn during the incident. Each garment was individually packaged to prevent contamination before being sent for forensic testing. Laboratories examined the clothing for blood, fibers, DNA, and any trace evidence that might help reconstruct the events of that night. Meanwhile, specialists searched the property for fingerprints and biological evidence. Modern forensic science allows investigators to recover microscopic traces that would once have gone unnoticed. Even the smallest fragment can become significant when combined with other evidence. Outside the house, investigators continued expanding the timeline. Officers visited businesses, restaurants, and locations the couple had attended earlier that evening. Witnesses were interviewed individually. Rather than relying on memory alone, detectives compared each statement with digital records to identify consistencies and discrepancies. Friends described Nadine as being in good spirits before the evening unfolded. Several people recalled seeing the couple together during the Christmas celebrations. Those accounts helped investigators establish the final confirmed moments before they returned to the house alone. Attention then shifted toward technology. By 2019, digital evidence had become one of the most valuable tools available to homicide investigators. Mobile phones record far more than conversations. Location information, call histories, text messages, internet activity, photographs, application usage. Together, these records can help investigators reconstruct movements with remarkable accuracy. Specialists obtained data from electronic devices connected to the investigation. Every phone call, every message, every timestamp, every available digital record was examined. Investigators compared these findings with witness accounts, emergency service records, and CCTV footage collected from nearby locations. Although surveillance cameras could not reveal what happened inside the house, they helped establish movements before and after the incident. Emergency service recordings also became important evidence. Dispatch logs documented precisely when calls for assistance were received, when paramedics were dispatched, and how long it took emergency personnel to arrive at the property. Those timestamps allowed investigators to build an accurate chronology of events during the critical hours before Nadine reached hospital. Medical experts were working just as intensively. Doctors who treated Nadine documented every injury with extraordinary precision. After her death, a post-mortem examination was conducted by a forensic pathologist. The findings would later become one of the prosecution's strongest pieces of evidence. Pathologists examined the extent, location, and nature of the injuries, seeking to determine how they had been sustained. Their conclusions would eventually play a central role during the trial. While forensic teams worked behind the scenes, detectives conducted repeated interviews with Daniel Murdaugh. As in every major homicide investigation, investigators carefully compared each version of events against the growing body of physical evidence. Whenever inconsistencies appeared, detectives returned with additional questions. Their objective was simple: determine whether the evidence supported the explanation being offered. As laboratory reports continued arriving, investigators believed the evidence was becoming increasingly consistent with their reconstruction of events. Each report strengthened the timeline they were building. Each witness statement filled another gap. Each forensic result added another layer to the investigation. Months passed as specialists completed their analyses. Unlike television dramas, homicide investigations rarely conclude within days. Complex forensic examinations require patience. DNA testing, medical reviews, digital analysis, independent expert reports. Every conclusion must withstand intense scrutiny because every piece of evidence may later be challenged before a jury. The Garda investigation eventually produced thousands of pages of documentation. Detectives assembled photographs, laboratory reports, witness interviews, emergency service records, forensic findings, and medical evidence into a comprehensive prosecution file. Prosecutors carefully reviewed every document before deciding the evidence met the legal threshold required to bring the case before the courts. Daniel Murdaugh was formally charged with Nadine Lott's murder. He denied the allegation. From that moment onward, the case entered a new phase. The investigation itself was largely complete. Now it would be tested in open court. News of the charge received widespread national attention. Across Ireland, newspapers carried Nadine's photograph alongside headlines announcing the forthcoming trial. Television broadcasters examined the evidence already made public, while legal commentators discussed the challenges prosecutors would face. The case resonated with many people because it involved two young adults whose lives had intersected in devastating circumstances. It also reignited conversations about violence within intimate relationships, coercive behavior, and the importance of recognizing warning signs before situations escalate into tragedy. Advocacy groups used the case to encourage greater awareness of relationship violence and to remind the public that abuse can occur in relationships regardless of age or background. For Nadine's family, however, public debate was secondary. Every news report, every television interview, every newspaper headline served as another reminder that someone they loved would never return home. They attended memorial events where friends shared stories of Nadine's kindness, generosity, and sense of humor. Flowers continued appearing in her memory. Community members organized tributes that reflected just how deeply her death had affected those around her. Yet despite the overwhelming public sympathy, one question remained unanswered. What had actually happened inside that house during the final hours before emergency services were called? The prosecution believed the forensic evidence would answer that question. The defense insisted the evidence would tell a different story. Only a jury, after hearing every witness, examining every expert report, and considering every piece of evidence, would decide which version of events was supported beyond a reasonable doubt. That decision would become the defining moment of one of Ireland's most significant murder trials in recent years. When the trial of Daniel Murtagh began before the Central Criminal Court in Dublin, public interest was immense. For more than 2 years, Nadine Lott's family had waited for this moment. They had attended memorials. They had mourned birthdays and holidays without her. Now, at last, they hoped the courtroom would answer the question that had haunted them since December 2019. What had happened during those final hours inside the house? The prosecution opened its case by telling the jury that the evidence would show Nadine's death was not an accident. Instead, prosecutors argued that Daniel Murtagh had intentionally inflicted the injuries that ultimately claimed her life. The defense rejected that allegation. Throughout the trial, Murtagh denied murdering Nadine. His legal team argued that the prosecution had failed to establish the necessary intent required for a murder conviction. That distinction would become one of the most important legal issues the jury would have to consider. Unlike television dramas, criminal trials rarely hinge on dramatic confessions or surprise witnesses. Instead, they are built piece by piece. Every document, every photograph, every expert report, every witness. Together, they create the narrative that jurors must evaluate. Over several weeks, the court heard testimony from numerous witnesses. Paramedics described the emergency response after they were called to the house. Medical professionals explained the treatment Nadine received after arriving at hospital. Doctors outlined the desperate efforts made to save her life before she died 2 days later. Their testimony was clinical, objective, focused entirely on the medical facts. The jury also heard from Garda investigators who described how the investigation unfolded. They explained how the crime scene had been secured, how forensic evidence was collected, and how the timeline was reconstructed using witness interviews, digital evidence, and scientific analysis. Photographs taken during the investigation were presented in court. Each image formed part of the prosecution's effort to reconstruct the events leading up to Nadine's death. Forensic specialists then took the witness stand. They explained the scientific examinations carried out after the incident and described how physical evidence was analyzed. Rather than relying on assumptions, they discussed measurable findings based on laboratory testing and accepted forensic methods. The prosecution argued that this evidence supported its version of events. The defense challenged those conclusions through cross-examination, questioning interpretations and highlighting areas where experts disagreed or where alternative explanations might exist. One of the most significant witnesses was the forensic pathologist who conducted Nadine's post-mortem examination. The pathologist carefully explained the medical findings and provided expert opinions regarding the cause of death. Because medical evidence often plays a decisive role in homicide trials, both sides devoted considerable attention to the testimony. The prosecution argued that the injuries were consistent with a sustained assault. The defense questioned whether all of the conclusions drawn from the medical evidence were the only reasonable interpretation. As is common in criminal trials, both sides relied heavily on expert witnesses to explain highly technical evidence to the jury. Digital evidence also featured prominently. Investigators presented phone records, timelines, and electronic data that helped establish the movements of those involved before and after the incident. These records allowed prosecutors to construct a minute-by-minute chronology that they believed supported their case. Jurors were reminded that while digital evidence cannot always explain why something happened, it can often establish when events occurred and whether statements are consistent with recorded activity. Witnesses who had seen Nadine and Daniel earlier that evening also testified. Their evidence helped establish the couple's movements before returning to the house. Although none of them witnessed the events inside the property, their testimony provided important context for the timeline. Throughout the proceedings, Daniel 𝘕𝘠𝘮𝘓 remained at the center of the courtroom. He maintained his plea of not guilty to murder. His legal team argued that the prosecution had not proven beyond reasonable doubt that he intended to kill Nadine. Intent is one of the defining elements separating different criminal offenses under Irish law, and the jury would eventually have to consider whether the evidence established that legal threshold. As closing arguments approached, both legal teams summarized weeks of testimony. The prosecution urged jurors to consider the totality of the evidence rather than focusing on any single piece. They argued that the forensic findings, medical testimony, witness accounts, and investigative timeline all pointed toward one conclusion. The defense reminded jurors that the burden of proof always rests with the prosecution. If any reasonable doubt remained, they argued, the law required the jury to return a verdict consistent with that doubt. For Nadine's family, every day inside the courtroom brought painful reminders of the daughter they had lost. They listened quietly as witnesses described the final days of her life. They heard medical experts explain injuries no parent should ever have to hear discussed. They sat through weeks of evidence in the hope that justice would ultimately be served. Once all the evidence had been presented, the trial entered its most critical stage. The judge began instructing the jury on the law they were required to apply. Their task was not to decide the case based on emotion, sympathy, or public opinion. Their responsibility was to carefully examine the evidence and determine whether the prosecution had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury retired to begin deliberations. For both families, the waiting began once again. Only this time, the next decision would determine the legal outcome of a case that had gripped Ireland for years. After weeks of testimony, expert evidence, witness examinations, and legal arguments, the responsibility for deciding the case now rested with 12 members of the jury. Their task was one of the most difficult any jury can face. They had listened to forensic scientists explain complex evidence. Medical experts had outlined the injuries that led to Nadine Lott's death. Detectives had reconstructed the events surrounding the investigation. The prosecution and defense had presented two very different interpretations of the same tragedy. Now the jurors had to determine whether the prosecution had proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Inside the courtroom, silence replaced the constant questioning that had filled previous weeks. For Nadine's family, every passing hour felt longer than the last. Since December 2019, they had endured unimaginable grief. Now they waited once again, uncertain of what the next chapter would bring. Daniel 𝘕𝘠𝘮𝘓 also waited. Maintaining his plea of not guilty to murder, He sat quietly while the jury considered the evidence presented throughout the trial. Outside the courthouse, journalists gathered daily. Television cameras remained positioned near the entrance. Each morning, reporters waited for any indication that the jury had reached a decision. The case had attracted widespread attention across Ireland, and many people followed every development as it unfolded. When the jury finally returned to court, everyone rose as the verdict was about to be delivered. The courtroom was completely silent. After considering the evidence, the jury found Daniel Murtagh not guilty of murder. However, they found him guilty of the lesser offense of manslaughter. The verdict reflected the jury's conclusion that the prosecution had not proven the legal element of intent required for a murder conviction, but that Daniel Murtagh was criminally responsible for Nadine Lott's death. For Nadine's family, the verdict brought mixed emotions. Although there was accountability through the manslaughter conviction, it was not the murder conviction they had hoped for. No verdict, regardless of its wording, could return the daughter they had lost. The legal proceedings then moved to sentencing. The judge carefully reviewed the evidence, victim impact statements, and legal submissions before imposing sentence. During sentencing, the court acknowledged the devastating consequences of the violence that had ended the life of a 20-year-old woman with her entire future ahead of her. The judge also reflected on the profound suffering experienced by Nadine's family, whose lives had been permanently changed. Members of Nadine's family delivered emotional victim impact statements describing the immense void left by her death. They spoke about birthdays she would never celebrate, Christmases where her chair would remain empty, dreams that would never become reality. Their words reminded everyone in the courtroom that behind every criminal case lies a family forced to live with loss long after the headlines disappear. Following the conclusion of the trial, tributes to Nadine continued throughout Ireland. Friends organized memorial events. Community members gathered to honor her memory. Flowers and messages of support continued to arrive for her family. Many remembered Nadine not because of the tragedy that claimed her life, but because of the kindness, warmth, and happiness she brought to those around her. Her story also became part of a broader national conversation. Advocacy organizations pointed to the case while discussing domestic violence, relationship abuse, and the importance of recognizing warning signs before situations escalate into tragedy. Experts emphasized that abusive relationships often develop gradually and may not always be visible to outsiders. The case encouraged renewed discussions about education, early intervention, and support services for those experiencing violence in relationships. For law enforcement, the investigation demonstrated the importance of combining forensic science, digital evidence, medical expertise, and traditional detective work to reconstruct events when there are no independent eyewitnesses. Each discipline contributed a vital piece of the puzzle. Together, they allowed investigators to present a detailed chronology of the final hours before Nadine's death. Years later, Nadine Lott's name continues to be remembered across Ireland. Not because people wish to revisit tragedy, but because her story reminds society of the importance of protecting vulnerable people, supporting victims of abuse, and ensuring that violence within relationships is never ignored. She was more than the subject of a criminal investigation. She was a daughter deeply loved by her family, a sister, a friend, a young woman whose life ended far too soon. Her legacy now lives not only in the memories of those who knew her, but also in the conversations her case continues to inspire about justice, accountability, and preventing similar tragedies in the future. The legal case has concluded. The verdict has been delivered. But for those who loved Nadine, grief has no closing argument. It has no final judgment. It simply becomes something they carry every day. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson this case leaves behind. Behind every courtroom file, every newspaper headline, and every criminal trial is a human life that mattered. A family forever changed. A future forever lost. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy carefully researched documentaries exploring true crime, criminal investigations, and the stories behind some of the world's most compelling cases, subscribe to Whispered Pages and turn on notifications so you never miss a new documentary.